Good evening and welcome to the Burnsville Parks Natural Resource Commission meeting for Monday, February 4th, 2019. Our first item of business is to approve the agenda for the evening. Are there any items that commissioners would like to add to the agenda? Seeing none, a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion approved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye as well. It is so moved. The second item is for approval of minutes for the previous meeting of January 7, 2019. Is there any item that commissioners would like to amend on the minutes? Do we have a motion for approval?
Motion to approve.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
It is so moved. The third item of business is for citizen comments. Do we have anyone who would like to address the commission this evening? Thank you, sir. Please state your name and your address for our records.
Sure. My name is Steve Benke, and I live at 13913 West Preserve Boulevard. And actually, I have a PowerPoint with some of the information on it, so I'm going to move to the other pedestal. I was watching the Park and Rec meeting from December 3rd, and I noticed the presentation by Kyra Bauer, who was a former youth commissioner for this commission. And I'm also a resident of the Sunset Pond neighborhood. I'm a 52-year resident of Burnsville. I'm 16 years in the Sunset Pond area, and I'm 5 years the camp volunteer. That's the Citizen Assistant Monitoring Program. We actually monitor the water of the local lakes and things like that. Basically, listening to her presentation, I realized that there was information that I felt was needed to be added to that. I realized that she did a really thorough report that's been brought to you guys and to staff. Essentially, I think her point was correct. The Sunset Pond is part of the stormwater system, and as such, it gets water from all of the lakes, all the way from Crystal Lake, and basically Sunset Pond is the last water body before the water ends up in the Minnesota River. Because of that, a lot of the nutrients and things come from upstream in addition to what is actually in Sunset Pond itself. I'd like to point out that I'm 41 years in the development industry, and a lot of my work has been getting projects approved and working with the cities in terms of water quality and development and how that all affects things. Basically, the information I have in the documents here, I also put into the. Do I have to open this full?
Please, thank you. Yes.
Okay. Essentially, Sunset Pond. To add a little bit of information to what Kara had, Sunset Pond has one major inlet on the southeast corner. That's a double arch pipe that comes basically from the other lakes in the area. There's all these other circles here are other minor storm sewers that come in from the local streets. I think that when Ms. Bauer was discussing this and she was talking about a rain garden, I think she probably had a good idea, but I think that the direction needed to be a little stronger. Essentially, Sunset Pond is a man-made lake. If you look at the historical maps, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it was basically a swamp and a farmer's field. In the early 80s, this property was to be developed as if you're familiar with data sales or with RUP or temp air, this entire side of the entire west side of Sunset Pond was to be developed as an industrial office warehouse type of a use. In the middle 80s, that wasn't selling outside of the two previously mentioned businesses. So the developer basically brought to the city council the proposal to turn that entire area into residential. Obviously, the east side also developed as residential. So what you end up with is several hundred residents who do look out on Sunset Pond on a daily basis. Because this is a man-made body, I really felt that a comparable project that has been developed elsewhere was Lake Nokomis. Lake Nokomis was also a man-made body. It was Lake Amelia, it was a swamp. In the 30s and the 40s, it was excavated, turned into a fairly nice lake. Obviously, it's a little different situation, but it's still in a residential area, but it also developed water quality issues. And basically speaking, as the camp volunteer, I can confirm Kara's comments. 2 years ago, I literally could not paddle my kayak across the lake. I couldn't get to the spot where I needed to make my water tests. The algae was 3, 4, 5, 6 inches thick on the lake. 2 years ago, last year it was less. But basically 3 years out of the last 5 years, it's been difficult to paddle a kayak across the lake. Currently, Sunset Pond does not really lend itself to any kind of water activities. There's a walking trail around it. You're very familiar with that area as a park commission. You guys know that it's a resource that's used by hundreds of people on weekends. I mean, literally, that trail is full. What I'm trying to get to is that Lake Nokomis developed water quality issues, and the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District came in along with some grant money that they had and basically created, at the south end of the lake, created 3 settling ponds, all designed to catch runoff from the city streets and help improve the quality of the lake itself. It's been a success. They started that in 2001. They've got 15 years of experience in it or more, and it is improving the quality. The reason I felt the need to come here was that I thought that it was important to show that it is a good idea to be proactive at water quality. It's a good idea to be proactive at trying to keep the lake from deteriorating. It is part of the city's physical plant. It is part of our stormwater system. Obviously, Public Works has a say in this as well. But I wanted to add information to that, to what she presented before. Also, just so you know, there is one rain garden on West Preserve. And one person, as part of a Boy Scout project, they actually created a rain garden beside their mailbox. They put a diverter on their driveway. Basically, all of their front yard drainage basically goes into that rain garden before it goes over into the curb. I mean, this is clearly something that can be done on an individual basis, but it isn't the big problem. The big problem, in my opinion, is that all the water from Crystal Lake down through Rose Pond and Twin Ponds and all the way down comes into Sunset Pond. And if there's going to be any work done that will improve the quality of the lake going forward, it really needs to be handled at those big inlets on the southeast corner of the lake. And honestly, having lived with the algae and lived with the scum that occurs in the summer, some of it's not bad, some of it's duckweed, some of it blows around in the wind. But I mean, quite honestly, the filamentous algae was obnoxious. The Sunset Pond also has all of the invasive species that are in Crystal Lake are in Sunset Pond. It's odd because the water itself is relatively clear. When I go out and do my tests, I can see bottom 2 meters down, 2.5 meters down, depending on the water level. But you have to find an open spot to be able to see that. So just wanted to let you guys know that, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for, I'm sorry?
Any questions I could?
Commissioners have any questions then?
I just
Go
have a
ahead.
comment. I
Dana.
see Daryl in the audience. Maybe you can speak a little bit. I don't know, it's been 18 months since we put the filtration system into Keller Lake to filter the nutrients that go to Crystal, that go down the system. What is the city's idea on how that'll affect Sunset Pond?
Sure, thanks. I'm Daryl Jacobson, Natural Resource Manager for the city. And yeah, all that stuff has been put in. As we know, Crystal Lake recently came off the impaired waters list. The Black Dog WMO, Watershed Management Organization, is doing an alum treatment on Keller Lake. And so, as you said, everything in Burnsville flows south to north up to the river, and it goes through a big chain. So anything that happens upstream is good for the things that are downstream. Also, as he mentioned, water quality itself is quite good in Sunset Pond. Filamentous algae, which has been a problem, in the last 3 or 4 years. I've been here 15 years, and when I started, it wasn't really an issue on Sunset Pond. But filamentous algae starts growing on the bottom of the pond, where the blue-green algae, which affects the water clarity, the small algae particles that kind of cloudy up the water, is a different type of algae. And so that's why with filamentous algae, really the sediment is more of the issue than the water itself, because it starts growing down there, gets its nutrients from the sediment, and then as it matures, it gets gas bubbles and floats to the surface. And so recently the city did start a program to treat that filamentous algae. It's a tough plant. It's not easy to get rid of, especially when it gets in those mats, as you mentioned, because all the herbicides and things that you can use are contact. And so it's hard to get, when you have a thick mat, something in contact with all of it. But it is something that's on the city's radar of trying to deal with that filamentous algae. Unfortunately, the rain gardens and things that are talked about are things that more get at the blue-green algae and the phosphorus that's in the water column. Really, that aspect would not have an impact directly on filamentous algae in the same manner it does on the blue-green algae, which is why when you swipe the filamentous algae away, the water's clear. And so on one hand, that's a good thing. We have something good there to start with. If we can get that filamentous algae under control, the rest of the water body is in pretty good shape. Obviously, there is invasive species in there that he mentioned. That's not unique. That is in every water body in Burnsville and probably the metro. So that's just something that you have to manage. Not likely to get rid of that issue. So hope that helps.
Thank you, Daryl.
Thank you.
Were there any other questions or comments then? Okay, yes, go ahead, Commissioner.
Yeah, I was glad that when you said you had difficulty getting across the pond, I made a note, filamentous duckweed. I didn't know what the situation was. It sounds like the sediments are pretty heavily nutrient loaded as well, and and with invasive species, I know on more recreational lakes, let's say like Crystal Lake, individual landowners are bringing in beach barbers and harvesters and so forth. Is there any value to considering any of those kinds of actions? I know they did the big Cleary Lake project years ago, and they also froze out the Potamogeton crispus and I think the Eurasian water milfoil too, but I think it was mostly focused on crispus. But
yeah, we've basically focused on algae control at this point. Sunset Pond, the shoreline is completely owned by the city, so there aren't homeowners obviously doing things to manage aquatic plants. But it's also not the same type of water body. There's no swimming, there is paddle boats, but there's the motor boats, that type of recreation. But we do a plant survey on it every year. Also, the Black Dog Watershed Management Organization does kind of what they call a habitat assessment, which includes not only the aquatic plants in the water, but also the nearshore areas to evaluate for, kind of the health of the ecosystem. So it is something that's monitored. Honestly, a couple of years ago, the biggest issue on that pond was coontail. And so there are the invasive plants, but there's quite a variety of different things actually in Sunset Pond.
So I'm assuming then your sampling is done kind of point intercept, set up a sampling grid, go out with a double-sided rake and drop it in and see what flavors are there?
Yep, density and species count, yep.
Yeah. So coontail, native,
Yes.
just likes nutrients. So
Okay, Okay, thank you, Commissioners, and thank you, sir, for taking the time to put together the presentation and talk to us. A very powerful perspective, and for you to come share it means a lot to the commission and the city. Thank you very much. That brings us to the next item on our agenda, which is application for a variance to allow construction of a single-family home on a vacant property along Crystal Lake. And presenting, we have Daryl Jacobson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Yes, here to present on the variance application for Crystal Lake. Let's see, the first slide here is just to give you an idea of the location. So there are two parcels kind of in the southeast part of Crystal Lake on Bluebell Bay Road, currently undeveloped. And these lots are smaller lots. To put in context, our current standards for kind of a recreational development lake like Crystal here is 20,000 square feet for lot size. Obviously, both of these lots are quite a bit smaller than that, and so it provides some challenges when you're looking to do development on there. This next slide kind of shows the proposed plan. One thing I want to point out is right in the middle, you can kind of see a gray line. That's the current property line as it sits today. The applicant will own both properties, and so part of this proposal would be to combine those properties into one lot. But even with doing that combining, the depth of the lots and other things, it still will require some variances to make it buildable. And another piece to this, it might be a little hard to see, but there's kind of a gray dotted line that goes up through the middle of those lots. That's currently a channel that's in the middle of these lots, and that conveys stormwater into Crystal Lake. There's a stormwater pond across the street. The majority of it's in Lakeville, goes under the road here, and then outlets through that channel into Crystal Lake. And a piece of this proposal would be to relocate that channel. Essentially fill the existing channel in and then reroute it kind of to the east or southeast. You can see that blue dotted line with kind of the blue shaded area would be the new location for that stormwater to go. So it would still come under the road into there, but then redirect it into Crystal Lake. That would kind of free up a bigger chunk of this parcel to kind of be together. Right now, that channel really kind of divides the two parcels. But the work in that channel, the relocation, the filling, all that is under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota DNR. And so an application has been made to them, and whether that's allowed or not is under their jurisdiction, so they'll make that determination. At this point, I've heard favorable things that they're comfortable with this, but they have not made a determination yet. Let's see. And so with that said, you can see that during the proposal, they would have the home, the driveway, that stuff on the kind of the northwest lot that we're looking at here as it currently is today. So with that, just quickly go over some of the variances that would be required for this proposal. First, there'd be a 31-foot lakeshore variance to allow the house to be set back 44 feet, instead of 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark. The current ordinance requires a 75-foot setback, but as you'll see down, it also requires a 30-foot setback from the road. And with these lots, the depth just is not there to meet those requirements. Also a variance, 37.5-foot variance for a future garage to be set back 37.5 feet from the ordinary high water mark. And then a 3-foot front yard variance to allow the home to be set back 27 feet instead of 30 feet from the road or the south lot line. And, you know, those three are kind of tied together, because if you can get the house a little closer to the road, it puts a little more distance on the backside to keep it a little farther from the lake. The next one here would be a temporary condition, and that would be for the east side. You know, currently there is a lot line between those two. And it would be for a 10-foot variance to allow future screen porch to be set back 0 feet from the property line. But again, this would be temporary because One of the conditions would be that this two lots be combined into one. Once that happens, then obviously there'd be a larger distance between the next lot line over, and so it would meet the current city ordinance for that side setback. Another thing to note is that any property that requires an ordinance, or excuse me, a variance from the shoreland ordinance is required to put in a native buffer, and the applicant does show a buffer that's at least 20 feet average in width across the property to be seeded with a native seed mix that is on the site plan. A couple conditions of the approval of this was it kind of moves through the process and gets to city council. One condition would be that the lots are combined before any building permits would be issued. And the other condition would be to get that permit from the Minnesota DNR to relocate the channel. And so both those would be conditions that city council would look at if they were to approve this. They would set those conditions on it so that those would be met before any building could happen on the lots. And I would also say that, as you look at these lots, city staff, natural resources, engineering, planning, city attorney, all worked closely with the applicant to try to come up with a plan that would, in our mind, kind of meet the intent of that shoreline ordinance and still allow the lot to be buildable. And so staff does support the variances that are proposed here. And I know the applicant is here in the audience tonight, so with that, I'd stand for questions, and if you had any for the applicant, they're here as well.
Commissioners, questions, comments for the presenter or the applicant? Commissioner Mark?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This looks typical to a lot of the lakeshore variances that I know that occur around, around a lot of the lakes in the area. So I see it as a reasonable thing. One of my questions is tied to whether a core permit is going to be needed for that fill-in of that old stormwater channel if it's replaced, and if there's a plan to where that would go. Because this is tied to that whole navigable waterway thing, that it does connect to the Minnesota River, so there's some core jurisdictional issues, I would believe.
Hi, good evening. I'm Todd Christofferson, and we're the applicant. My wife Nancy is here. And Daryl did a great job explaining it, so I appreciate that. And it has taken a lot of work with everybody involved. It's been quite a journey already. Very good question. The DNR, when we applied for that permit, then forwarded that to the Corps of Engineers, and they said, yes, we do need a permit for that.
Okay.
So we've applied for that, and they've told us that it all looks very favorable. There's two things that they have to follow through on, and they're doing that now. It's to make sure that there's a certain kind of bat that nests, and if that,
northern long-eared bat.
yes. So they just need to check that box, and something with native cultural, like burial grounds. Just not that they're concerned they're there, it's just a process they have to do and check the box. So with
The State Historic Preservation Office probably is where they're checking with that.
Sure.
On the cultural resource side.
right. So that's in progress.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Additional?
I just have a quick question. I'm just curious on this dry stream bed. Is the water actually going to come from the holding pond into there, or is this going to be one of those dry beds that sometimes has water in it, sometimes doesn't? And where's that water coming from?
Yep, the water will be coming from the same place it comes from now for the channel, so it is still from the
Okay.
stormwater pond across in Lakeville. I believe the elevation for that creek bed has just changed a little bit from what the current channel is. The current channel does hold water all the time, and can get stagnant in there if there's not stormwater flow going through. And so I believe the design here would hopefully allow water to still flow as it does, but then if you have a dry period, it wouldn't hold the water there. essentially would be dry during those dry periods, so.
Okay.
So the old channel would be, would that be a filling situation, or would it just be left in, in its current state as a dip? Because I know you can see it on the aerial photograph pretty clearly.
No, it would be a
So-
filling, so it'd be
Okay.
relocating the channel, essentially, fill that current one in and put in a alternate route for it.
So how large of a wetland footprint does this currently have for the
Well-
filling area, for the area for this being filled?
Well, the current channel is man-made, so the I can't remember the year, but back, I think, maybe it was around 2000, maybe earlier than that. The property owner at the time had got a permit from the DNR because there was an existing different channel there.
Okay.
And so they got a permit from the DNR at the time to put the channel in that's existing today. As when you look at it, it's very straight and, man-made looking. And so, because of that, basically there are no wetlands above 934.5 elevation, which is the ordinary high water mark of Crystal Lake. And so that's why the DNR has the jurisdiction over this and not a wetland, it's not the Wetland Conservation Act or any wetland impacts per se. And so, we did look at it and came up with that determination that there was essentially no wetland features above that elevation. And so the DNR's got the jurisdiction, and they, I know, have looked at it, I think, from the standpoint of there's been alterations made in this location in the past. And so they want to keep the function, obviously, of what's there, but they're at least open to, having some changes made as the feedback I've received from them, so.
Okay, thanks. Good clarification.
I had a question about the variance to decrease the distance from the high water mark. Is there concerns of flooding on the structures that are being built closer to the water?
No, it's still based on elevation, so there are elevation requirements that like low floor of the home or low opening has to be 2 feet above. And so the elevations are still being met, and so there is not a concern from that standpoint.
Okay. I think that was my biggest concern for the property. Go ahead,
Just
Commissioner.
one last thing is that I know that seed mixes are great. I think the supplier here listed supplies good materials. One thing that just a suggestion, not a requirement. I would think that using wetland plugs, especially closer to the actual shoreline, can help further shorten the establishment period for the plants. So just a thought, gives it a little more, reinforces the buffer, gets it going faster. So just a point of interest, I guess.
Thanks.
If there are no other questions or comments from the commission, we are looking for approval of the variance from the commission for this property. So if there's nothing else, do we have such a motion to approve the variance to allow construction of one single-family home on the vacant property located between 1228 and 1304 Bluebell Bay Road?
Can I just ask for a point of clarification?
Certainly.
So our approval would be also contingent on the two contingencies that you mentioned, both the combination of the plats and then also the DNR approval, is that correct?
Yes, essentially you'd be recommending approval to the city council. You could do it based on those conditions.
And the core permit too.
Yep.
Okay, so recommendation to approve based on those three contingencies, I guess.
I'll third.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
And I as well. It is so moved.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and your presentation, Mr. Jacobson. That brings us to our next item on the agenda, which is the BSLI Concept Plan, Planned Unit Development Review, presented by Garrick Beck, Parks and Recreation Facilities Director.
All right, good evening, Commissioners. I'm here tonight to talk about the Burnsville Sanitary Landfill. Staff recently received a concept PUD application from Waste Management in regards to this facility here. Items like these ultimately will go before the Planning Commission as well. However, some of you may be aware of the fact that Burnsville Sanitary Landfill already had approved plans for a golf course to be constructed on top of it at its end of use. So while this proposal will ultimately still be going to Planning Commission and on to council, staff is looking for feedback from the PNRC before that next meeting takes place with Planning Commission. So just the agenda tonight, we'll go through a history just so everyone's aware of this facility and what its function is and why this application is before us. To do that, we'll talk a little bit about the plan in 2002 and in 2006, and then ultimately share some of the features related to the 2018 concept plan that is before us right now. And then I'd like to close out with end-of-use options and possible recommendations from the PNRC if we were to assume that there was an approval of this concept plan and a replacement of that golf course. So the facility itself is a mixed municipal solid waste facility, and that's located in our Minnesota River Quadrant, and it is owned, as I mentioned, by Waste Management. This facility itself has been operating since 1960, and as of November, we learned that based on the current waste acceptance rates at that facility, it has less than 3 years of capacity on it. As I mentioned, the Waste Management recently submitted a new concept PUD, and the purpose of that PUD is to initiate a process that would allow them to expand that facility to take on more waste. And then also, if that expansion took place, they would have guidance and a process to move forward in the developmental stage process. After, I kind of talked a little bit about that. So after we talked about this evening, as I mentioned, that information will go on to Planning Commission. And so for this evening, what we're really looking for is for the PNRC to weigh in specifically on what the recreational use of that space would be at end of use. So in 2002, the end of use plan was kind of laid out that there would be an 18-hole golf course on top of the site. Waste Management returned in 2006 with a developmental stage PUD, and that document kind of outlined a 4-phase development process that would be constructed from 2011 through 2025. Obviously, that has not happened at this point, but they were going to start off with the driving range, and then after a few years add a 9-hole golf course. As more time passed, they'd come back and make the golf course, the 9 holes, more difficult, and then they would conclude at the end of the process with an 18-hole course with a clubhouse and whatnot. With the new 2018 concept plan, the thought is that the golf course would be eliminated. And as you can see on the screen here, this is the site itself. And if we look at the top in the white rectangle, you see that under existing conditions that were part of the 2002 and 2006 PUD, the actual site would be closed out, and it would be a relatively, not perfectly flat, but a relatively flat process or top to it where you could indeed fit a golf course on it. This expansion process would involve not going wider, but instead it would involve going up. So you can see elevation changes that are listed on there, the change in slope and the narrowing of the flat surface. As a result of that, if that expansion is approved, it would be very difficult from an engineering standpoint to construct an 18-hole golf course on top of a facility like this at that time. So that's the first reason that we are looking for acceptance of some changes to that plan tonight. The second thing really has to do with how the world of golf has changed since 2002. When this was being talked about back in 2002 and again in 2006, golf was really ramping up, and statistics show that golf had reached its prime in 2005. So made a lot of sense of what was going on at that time, that we'd be looking at a golf course here in Burnsville with only a 9-hole course in our city at this time. During that same period from 2000 to 2006, there were 41 new courses being built in Minnesota. So we weren't alone in the thought that that might be a good place for a golf course. Unfortunately, since 2006, nationwide 643 golf courses have closed, including 47 of them here in Minnesota. So in addition to the engineering constraints already mentioned, it just does not seem to be a good decision at this time, knowing what we know, to think about putting a golf course at that location. One other thing to keep in mind, this area is in our Minnesota River Quadrant, and part of the objectives of our Burnsville 2040 comp plan for this area is that we kind of create riverfront access for our community, that this is a recreational area with open space and supporting natural habitats and whatnot. So with that said, we took the concept of what we're hoping to get out of the Minnesota River Quadrant from the comp plan, and we applied some things from our 2017 Parks and Recreation System Master Plan. And I'm bringing to you tonight some of the things that would satisfy the possibility of putting recreational opportunities on this site that are feasible with the type of site that we're talking about, that would also satisfy the comp plan and would satisfy things that our residents have indicated are valuable to them through our 2017 Parks and Recreation System Master Plan. So you can see in the list, walking and biking trails. A facility like this could take on both a paved path for walking and off-road type trails for biking. There is reference to mountain bike skills park interest in Burnsville that could be located at the bottom of a facility like this in a flat area, and then allow people to venture into the actual facility itself. Observatories, you'll see later on, I have some examples of some facilities like this that have been closed out across the country, on just some possibilities related to that. The plan indicated we have a shortage of large picnic shelter areas to accommodate larger gatherings in our community, which may fit in well in open spaces like this. Multi-purpose field space, fitness parks, dog parks, all types of things that could be placed in, on, or near one of these facilities. Our applicant shared just a basic concept of what they see could be a possibility for a facility like this on the site. You can see here on their rendering that you come in on the road, hit a trail, that a paved trail for cars that takes you over to a parking lot area. This is a gradual, I believe it was about a 5% slope trail that could be used for walking, that you can see would ultimately take you near the top of a facility that could possibly have sight lines over the river. The brown squiggly line is a mountain bike trail. The green lines were representing disc golf, which staff provided feedback that without trees and obstacles, that may not be an optimal decision to place something like that on top of a facility like this, just from a challenge standpoint related to get to disc golf and whatnot. I mentioned I'd share with you some similar facilities that have been closed and turned over to recreational space. This particular one is Cully Park in Oregon. And this just gives you an idea of what a walking trail might look like, and some of the structures that you could see. This is a poured-in-place space with an overhead canopy and picnic tables and some climbing rocks and different things that can exist on the top of a facility or near a facility like this. This is Mount Trashmore in Cedar Rapids. and actually has a very similar, their plan is very similar to the one that Waste Management shared with us, with a walking trail that takes itself up to the top of the facility, where they have this particular overlook that overlooks the river there. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what something like that would look like. And then the right picture over here is what these, the brown mountain bike trails would look like, or have the potential to look like if you were to put something like that on a facility like this. And then the final one that I have for you to consider for this evening is Mount Trashmore in Virginia Beach. Again, this is their higher slopes of the facility, which they have stayed off of mostly, but they have trails around it, and then they've added a lot of recreational opportunities around it with an inclusive playground and shelters and a building over here. And then later they added a skate park with a rather large ramp and whatnot, and you can see how people are utilizing the hill to watch different things that take place and whatnot. So that is just 3 examples that I came across that on how a similar facility could be, could have a different type of end use than a golf course itself. With that, I will turn over any questions that you may have about the facility. I know that we do have a representative from Waste Management here tonight. If you have any other questions, we can certainly welcome him to the podium.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. Commissioners, comments and questions?
So I have a couple of questions. What kind of acreage are we looking for, like looking at in terms of the end completion?
If you want to come up so you can tag team this with me.
Hi. The total facility has about 350 acres is what we're looking at for our total facility. That is on and off waste, so we have some total acres of waste is, off the top of my head, it's 190, and the rest being wetlands and other roadways and stuff around the facility.
Okay.
And those would be maintained in this current plan? Because I know that there is a lot of wetland down there that seems appropriate for that particular area in terms of the waterway that's directly next to it.
Yes, there's more wetlands. We have to create some more wetlands. There's some areas along the river where we have some historic river dredge that's been placed there that we have to remove and restore that. It's not part of this project, but it's part of our conditional use permit that we have to clean that area up before we even get to this final closure point. And a lot of that's all been dedicated to the city in an area that's called Outlot A. I believe it's a 20-acre parcel that is dedicated for park and recreational use along the riverfront.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious about the restoration of it looks like it's desired to keep the slopes in grass as opposed to putting trees on it. I'm assuming that's partly because eventually the trees will suppress the grasses and then you have erosion issues. I'm making some suppositions here, but any final thought on whether you'd be using native things or brooms and bluegrasses, or have you gotten that far?
We haven't gotten that far as a seed mix, and what we'd probably try to match that with the end use. As far as trees, trees are generally prohibited by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, as they're trying to control the root growth of whatever we're planting on top of it, so it does not compromise any cap that we'd have on it.
Right, you get a tree tip and you have trouble. So.
Right.
Okay, great.
To Mark's point, I think it would be a tragedy to seed it with anything other than something native, Minnesota native grass and wildflower mix. So I hope going forward that is strongly considered from my perspective as well. Do you have something?
So as far as the other Mount Trashmores, or whatever you call them, is it a similar elevation to what we're expecting at the end of this? I mean, in terms of how that ends up looking in terms of the natural kind of riverways and that kind of thing? It looked like that last Mount Trashmore, I can't remember where it was, had a similar kind of location to the river there. So I was just wondering if that was like a similar viewpoint in terms of what we would expect with the increase in capacity for this particular site.
When I was kind of looking into options for Burnsville, I didn't get into the details. In my mind, I was looking for things that visually were, but I did not get into the elevation points of those. I don't know, is this the one that you were
Yeah.
referencing
Yep.
in Cedar Rapids where you can see it clearly gets to a higher point, and that's where they went with the outlook over the river, and that seemed to fit in very nicely with kind of what our situation was. So unfortunately, I can't share that elevation with you
Okay.
at this time, but intentionally, I was looking for ones that had higher slopes that would prohibit a golf course from being placed on top of them, so.
Yeah, I guess just a comment. I have no problem with it not being a golf course, considering the fact that we are seeing many more of those kind of close and potentially be redeveloped into non-natural areas, which I think is the benefit of the golf course, right? Is you maintain some greenery. So I support the way that we currently have it kind of viewed out. I'd maybe question a dog park that close to the river, just knowing kind of what our, if you look at some of our other dog parks kind of over by, I can't think of the name.
Elementa.
Magnet, there you go. We end up with some runoff issues and kind of capacity there. So I'd maybe rethink that, but the other, aspects seem like a good fit.
The regional trail looks like it goes around the site. Will there be a spur that you could access those, whatever trails or facilities end up being built there?
Yeah, part of our final development of this will be trying to get the regional trail placed in a good spot, I guess. We're working on this in conjunction with the Kramer Mining. They're doing some modifications of their PUD as well, and we're trying to merge the two of them together. And if we can get some cooperation from the Cargill folks going into Savage and try to get this whole trail system kind of worked out, so it's not just on the waste management property, so it flows through the whole area. That's kind of what we're looking for.
Okay.
But a lot of things to be determined yet.
Certainly. So I think maybe what we're ready to do at this point is to take the recommendation, maybe in two parts here. First, to accept the removal of the golf course as part of the end-use vision. So can we get a motion for that?
Motion.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that is so moved. And then the second part of that was to consider approving several alternate use and end-use options that would satisfy Parks and Rec system master plan. So the uses were outlined here in bullet points. I'm sure this will come to us many times in the future to kind of finesse what the end is going to be. But those are some of the options there. So seeing those, do we have a motion to approve alternate end-use options for this site?
Motion to approve.
And a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye as well, and that is so moved. So if there's nothing further from the commission on that end, well, thank you for your time and your presentation, both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
That brings us to the next item on our agenda, which is miscellaneous.
Commissioners, I would like to remind you that tomorrow night, our work plan will be presented to City Council at their meeting at 5:30. Commissioner or Chair Kiefer is going to be presenting that information. You are all welcome to attend and support her and the commission, but it is not required. The second item I have is that our March meeting is scheduled for 6:30 on March 4th. Agendas will be out in according timeline. And then our final item that I have is I would like to extend a thank you to Commissioner Tweedy, who has served on our commission for 2 years, but unfortunately has submitted his letter of resignation because he is no longer going to be living in our fine city. So thank you to Commissioner Tweedy for your help and your guidance over the past couple of years. Appreciate
It's
it.
been very enjoyable. It's a privilege to serve the community in any capacity. This has been very rewarding, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you,
it.
Commissioner Tweedy. All right, that then brings us to the end of our formal meeting. Do we have a motion to adjourn
Motion adjourned.
and a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I as well, and is so moved. Thank you for attending or viewing the Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting.